Now, here's a bit of a worry. South Africans are being warned of looming fuel shortages following the closure of several refineries in the country. From 6 refineries in 2019, the country has only 2 operating refineries, and a third one, the Astron Energy refinery, set to be online by the end of the year. Now, this has led to an increased reliance on imports. Aviation Analyst Des Latham says the knock-on effect of not having enough local refinery capacity paired with global supply chain issues could lead to further trouble for motorists. Des is with us now. Nice to have you, Des. Thanks so much for chatting to us this morning.
Thanks for having me, Leanne.
While this has to do with several of the country's refineries that have closed down, we're still able to get fuel, obviously. I mean, we don't want to make people start getting nervous about this and start rushing and stockpiling fuel, let's put it that way. But let's get a realistic idea of what the situation is looking like. Is it critical?
It's been critical for a couple of years, really, if you look at what's happened with the refineries and also with the cost of fuel and the supply issues, as I mentioned. So it's just now that it's come to the attention of the public, I guess. But for people involved in the industry, it's been some pressure on supply for some time. And because it's a strategic mineral, there's a perception that government has kind of played a little fast and loose with the strategic reserves here. There was a sell-off in 2015 of all our strategic reserves. The High Court reversed that in 2020, and we're supposed to be building a 90-day reserve of fuel. We don't have 60, and from our accounts recently, it's probably down to more like 35, 40 days of fuel, which sounds like a month, which is fine, you'd imagine, except when you have something like a protest where people set fire to pipelines. And then everything slips backwards, as we had with the riots last year.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about the products that are affected, what are we looking at? And I mean, is it basically all types of fuel that are under threat right now?
Pretty much. We look at the pipelines, which transfer most of the fuel from the coast into Johannesburg, and secondly, tankers. So there's a split between the diesel and petrol, and we need about 11 billion litres of petrol a year and about 12 billion litres of diesel. And most of that comes by a pipeline, a single pipeline that Natref runs from the coast or Portnet runs up into the Highvelds and then stored at various locations. Then there are quotas for jet fuel. So each airline has a quota and they sign an agreement the year, often and more ahead, purchasing the fuel. And then they're supplied by individual suppliers. The state really just runs the pipeline in the same way that it kind of runs the road, I guess. And then the people who purchase and buy and sell are all private from there on. So there's a clash sometimes between the expectations and with the airlines in the start, where some airlines have made mistakes with their quotas and purchases and have had to fly around the country refueling in various other places. There's been a shortage because of the strikes and also because of the flood damage in KZN. So there are various ports and various facilities that we get paraffin and so on through. But basically, one pipeline does most of the grunt work.
Sure, and that's worrying. I mean, when you look at the bigger picture of things, and how long is that going to sort of, as long as it works properly, great. But the minute there are problems, that's when we all feel it. Now, you talk about the ports, and I mean, this has been a major issue with the strikes affecting Transnet. And, you've got lots of people, particularly, just one that I'm reading from here, Kevin Bart from the South African Petroleum Industry Association, saying that port facilities and pipeline networks are struggling to cope with increased fuel imports. As we said in the introduction, we're now becoming very dependent on imports after the closure of these refineries. But I mean, the situation at the ports right now and the backlogs, do we have any indication of that?
Yes, it's compounded by a crime. We've been battling this mafia that's traveling around the country, whether it's in the construction sector or in transport, who have been attacking infrastructure parapolitically. Some believe there's a political motive there. But the point is that a couple of years ago, they stole hundreds of thousands of litres at Van Rieenen. They had a number of tankers. This is organized crime who rented tankers and then siphoned fuel off. We're not as bad as Nigeria, which has a big problem with this. But the signs are there that the dislocation caused by a law and order breakdown in parts of the country has increased the threat to this strategic mineral. And so we must take that into account. The signs are not good for the future when it comes to that side of things. It's unstable. So much so that the private operators have got drones in the air monitoring these pipelines. They've got private security companies, which are like mercenaries running up and down the pipelines, making sure, and the crime rate has dropped slightly on this. So we must keep that in mind at the back of our minds. As South Africa experiences this dislocation politically, the forces out there who are aware of using a weakness in law and order are actually targeting infrastructure in particular. And so that's another worry for us. The supply chain pressures have built up internationally based on the availability of tankers. And because I've said this before, we at the southern tip of Africa, it's quite a long journey from the Middle East. Most of our fuel comes from our oil, comes from Saudi Arabia, some comes from Nigeria, some Angola, Iran, places like that. So the African countries are closer by, but we still have the problem of getting most of our fuel or our oil imports from Saudi Arabia. So you can see that when there's a shortage of tankers and the costs go up per daily rate, and it's $10,000 to $15,000 a day for these tankers now to rent them, and more, we are kind of at the back of the queue to some extent. So that's compounding this.
I want to sort of get a better understanding, and I suppose maybe along with viewers as well, to just understand a little bit more about what happened with our local oil refineries. I mean, at 2019, if we look back to 2019, which is not a long time ago, we had 6 oil refineries operating, producing around 700,000 barrels a day. Now we're down to 3, and I mean, obviously we're waiting. I think it's the Sasol one that hopefully will be online by the end of the year, and we're looking now at about 350,000 a day, but that's once Sasol is online. How did we find ourselves in a situation like this?
I think it's strategic planning, which has been weak about the state for some time, probably the last decade. The state and the government in particular has spent a lot of time navel gazing at itself. There's been infighting inside the ruling party. There's been allegations of, our eyes been taken off the ball. Infrastructure generally has gone into free fall, really. If you look at the roads and some of the systems of our country, the maintenance is not acceptable. And I think in a nutshell, that's what's happened to us, is that there seems to be an understanding that it's year-to-year management, crisis management, and very little strategic understanding of what we need to do here. I mean, one of the main things that needs to be said is that South Africa in 2011 had one of the most advanced plans for sustainable and renewable energy in the world. We were in line with China's change in terms of moving to solar and so on. And then for all sorts of political reasons, that slipped off the charts. And now we live with a situation where most of our car manufacturers or assemblers are battling with the demand from Europe and other parts of the world who want electric cars. And our electric car processes locally are pathetically behind the curve. And so we've got ourselves in a spot of bother here because most of the world is shifting to electric car use and we're still relying on fuel. So we have this disconnect in terms of strategy, in terms of state strategy here, about how we're going to deal with this 10, 15, 20-year process. We're not talking about just the fact we can't get fuel from the Middle East in the next 2 or 3 months. We're talking about a big idea. How are we going to run ourselves? And there's a shortfall here. There's a lack of strategic planning.
Yeah, which is very, very concerning because this dependency on importing fuel, because obviously it's the idea of the costs, which we know we're seeing the price increasing rapidly, and I think we're more than likely, I'm not sure, but perhaps could be in for another hike, even though we have seen some reduction happening, but it's still very expensive. Now, add to that the fact that we're importing, which could lead to around about 60% of local imports, of local demand would be imported. And when we look at the operations of our ports and things that are coming through and the issues associated with Transnet, I mean, there are many people calling the Transnet the next Eskom, and that is a great worry. What will happen then? I mean, could we get to a point where we actually are having fuel rationing happening here in South Africa?
Yes, I lived through fuel rationing in 1981-82 with the Iran-Iraq War. And, the speed limit was dropped to 100. You weren't allowed to carry spare fuel. You were arrested if you had containers. And you had to get a special license to operate all fuel garages, for example, closed at 6 p.m. You had to get a special license from the police to buy fuel after that time and so on. So having lived through that, I know that it's feasible. I say this to people and they think I'm kind of crazy, but I'm saying to them, look, the possibility exists that we will have a situation where that kind of thing returns, because it's the nature of the beast in terms of the world economy and the cost and the supply chain issues, and also our local instability politically and with infrastructure. It's kind of clear, if you do all of the SWOT analysis and strategic thinking about this, that we will have destabilization of the supply in the next year. And by the way, the cost of fuel is going up in November, possibly by more than R1 for diesel, for example. So all of these things means that as a motorist, you should really start thinking about, we're not allowed to store a large amount of fuel, it's illegal, but you should start thinking about how you use fuel and some of your plans going forward. I believe that we need to be careful about this. We are heading into a heavy fuel period of travel in December. So perhaps start thinking about how you're going to do this.
Sure. I don't know. I have no idea how. And that's the reality. I don't have my own fuel pump at home, and I don't think anybody else does either. And at the same time, we don't want to cause panic of people sort of going and buying fuel reserves, and then we start running out of it. But, you know, there certainly are alarm bells ringing, and that's something we need to keep in the back of our minds. But, you know, what can we do? What are the factors that South Africa perhaps could introduce in order to mitigate all of these things that we've been talking about?
Well, first of all, in the short term is to increase the supply and storage inland. We don't store enough fuel inland. We rely on this pipeline. And people who are politically inclined know that if they just blow up one pipeline, it will heavily affect this country. So we need to think strategically about stability, and then increase the amount of fuel that is stored, oils that are stored inland. We have mine shafts, and that's where we used to store a lot. Government used to concretize, if you like, or seal these mine shafts and then drop the fuel into the mine. And so we have various available possibilities here of storing fuel. So that's the first, is to take advantage of some of the supplies when there is an opportunity to do this. Secondly, on refining, we cannot, it's not sustainable to run a fuel refinery that less than 100,000 barrels. So we need to look at how some of these NATREF and other refineries can operate more effectively together, perhaps, and strategically work together. It's not all about just return on investment and just cash. We have to look at the threat to us as a nation state. And I'm not quite sure what we can do there, but there is a possibility for some kind of discussion about stabilizing things. And thirdly, we need to very, very quickly move to more sustainable energy forms, because being reliant for Eskom on diesel generators just makes no sense in a country that gets 300 days of sunshine a year.
Yeah.
We need to very quickly return to that model and understand that I'm talking to you from a house that has no energy problems during lockdown. I run my company here. We have a number of solar panels on the roof and a battery and an inverter, and I don't go down when everyone goes down, and I've saved my business because of that. So we have to start thinking ourselves about how we use these things and not rely on government to feed us, but to think as entrepreneurs, as individuals, and as communities. And that's the big picture, I think, is try and move away from thinking about just petrol and fuel the whole time.
Yeah,
because it's not going to be around. And when I'm very, very old, in 20 years' time, we're not going to be using fuels like we use them now. We're going to be using the effect of the sun.
Yeah, and I mean, this is where a lot of people are moving in that direction, but let's be real. If you can afford to do it, that's one thing. But I just think the average household here in South Africa, an individual cannot afford to do that, and are unfortunately completely dependent on the inefficiencies of government. I mean, that's what's happening. And we talk about the fuel shortages. We talk about, I mean, again, you're saying diesel going up perhaps another rand. You know, and the reality is the way we find ourselves now, probably one of the ways that many people are operating their businesses are through generators, which uses diesel fuel. Now, if you're telling us that we're running into fuel shortages, even the cost of diesel it keeps going up, and we need to question that all of the time, because industry is dependent on diesel as we speak right now. We could bring this country to a dead standstill, from what I'm hearing.
Well, as I said to you, we had it before during apartheid, 1981-2. It was, the country literally came to a standstill. It was a crisis. economically at a knock-on effect you can very easily understand. And now our populations are much bigger, and we are more dependent on outside forces when it comes to this fuel process. So the signs are that we need some kind of goal-oriented plan from government that says that part of the fuel is subsidized, that the fight going on internally around Eskom and the unions and so on needs to be addressed rapidly. It's a critical threat to all of us as South Africans to have people at war with each other, basically around resources and infrastructure, when we have a much bigger threat approaching us, which is the changed economic environment of the world, and we slipped off the charts here. And we can very quickly turn it around. We just need some kind of vision from folks who can say, okay, look, we are now going to subsidize your solar panels to address your comment about the costs. We are now going to move away from the model that talks about coal, because there's still a tussle going on there, with particularly the unions of our country and internally in government, and understand that that we're into the 21st century. We cannot rely on fossil fuels. It's old-fashioned. It's 19th century pre-Victorian thinking. So we need to somehow snap to attention and move away from this and recognize too, most importantly for me, that there's innovation, entrepreneurial opportunities for even poorer South Africans to deal with this and start new businesses and so on. So that's the big picture, I think.
Indeed. All right, Des, we'll have to leave it there for now. Thanks so much for talking to us this morning. And also will be interesting to see what the Finance Minister actually has to say about this, and perhaps tabling something with regard to it, the best fiscal policy move to make under the circumstances. Will be interesting to listen and find out what he has to say. Aviation Analyst Des Latham discussing the challenge of looming fuel shortages in South Africa.